I again had the opportunity to sit down with one of the candidates here in Leander for council this next election cycle, mayoral candidate Damon Burger. This is our conversation here on Lean and Leander. So we're back here again at Lantern Media Studios for the next episode of Lean and Leander and the Vote in Leander series. And with me today is a candidate for mayor, Mr. Damon Burger. Damon, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
No, I really appreciate you making the time and coming out here to have a quick little chat with me. So Damon, I know a little bit about you from like your website and whatnot. You've offered some information for folks to kind of get a sense of who you are. So we're going to kind of try to explore that a little bit here and get your origin story, so to speak. So from your website, I understand that you guys your family has moved into the Leander area about 4 years ago.
Yep,
right?
A little over 4 years.
So what brought you here 4 years ago?
Work.
Okay.
Work. Took a new job that landed us here in the greater Austin area, Leander. Moved here a few days after January 2020.
Okay.
And then we kind of all know what happened after that. We had
right.
Snowmageddon and COVID.
Great timing.
Right. Yeah. But no, I mean, it's been great. We love Leander. Kids are all in school, have adjusted well. We've moved several times over the last 10 years or so. So when the kids complain about that, I say, hey, listen, you guys have had all these different experiences, get to live all over the country. So, no, but we're happy to call Leander home. It's been great.
So prior to Leander, you don't need to give us a step-by-step, but like where were you most recently outside of that?
Twin Cities, metro area of Minnesota.
Oh, really?
Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Oh,
yep.
So, I mean, when you got here in Snowmageddon, you felt right at home, right?
I was all for it. This is great. And we were thinking summers were going to be pretty mild. I will have to say, though, from an infrastructure standpoint, we didn't have water for a week, and we were just scratching our heads saying, how is this?
Like,
How can cold and do all this?
Right.
Anyways, so.
Oh, that was one of those 1,000-year things or whatever it was. I mean, it was pretty bananas from that perspective. The Snowmageddon was crazy. I had been here. At that point, I think I had been here at least a year, if not two. I'm trying to remember when I first got here. But, so that was bananas.
Yeah, and then you sprinkle in COVID and
on top of everything
anybody
else.
from anybody, and everybody's like, ooh.
That's a little crazy. I'm surprised that you're still here.
Hey. Fighting the good fight.
No,
so,
good for you. Good for you. So you mentioned that your job brought you here, and as I am typically wanting to kind of point out to those who are viewing the podcast or listening to the podcast, when you're putting yourself into the public sphere as a civic, volunteer for all extents and purposes, here in Leander, the way that our council is set up, it is a volunteer position. You're not really being paid to be a council member or mayor or whatnot. That said, you have a real job, like you do stuff that makes money and pays bills, right? So help our audience understand what that is for you. Like, what do you do for a living?
Yeah. So I currently, for the last 20 plus years, I've been in the physical security safety sort of space.
Okay.
In more kind of senior leadership positions with different organizations. Most of that has been within the retail sector.
Okay.
So pick your big box retailer. Some are still with us. Some unfortunately have gone the way of the dinosaur. Been with them. When I was in Minnesota, I was with Goodwill.
Okay.
Running their safety and security program for them. And then way back when, spent a handful of years in law enforcement as a police officer in our hometown of Wisconsin.
So is that kind of like where you started on that particular path towards, you started in law enforcement?
Yeah, so started in law enforcement. That was the dream. And did that for several years. And then my wife and I had our first child.
Right.
At the time, she was working a normal 9 to 5. I was working thirds, mandatory overtime. When we would see each other, I'd say, who are you? Oh, we have a kid now. So priorities changed.
Right.
And the kind of naturally kind of came into this space and never looked back.
Right.
So-
Okay, that's cool. So, moved to Leander, and what are your thoughts so far? Let's take Snowmageddon out of the conversation. But like, you've been here 4 years. What are some of the things that you see? Again, you're coming from Twin Cities. You have a little bit of experience. It sounds like you moved around a little bit. Comparatively speaking, give me an example of one of the things that you've encountered, or one of the things you've had an opportunity to engage with here in Leander that you're like, hey, this was really good, or hey, I really didn't like that.
Yeah. So I would say, on the positive side, definitely the people. They're great, down to earth, real people. Where in the bigger metro cities, you don't really have a lot of that. So I think, we've made some really terrific friends and acquaintances since we've lived here. I think, conversely, on the negative side, I like the small town, more rural sort of, that fits me very well.
Mm-hmm.
But when my wife and I do have the opportunity to go out on date night or something like that, we're either in Cedar Park or Austin or in Georgetown, right? We don't have all the things,
Right.
So I think definitely those are the ones that stand out. But I mean, ultimately, it's been a great ride so far.
Yeah, no, and I would concur. Again, you've been here just slightly less than I have. I've been here 6 years. Actually, this month will be 6 years in Leander, and I completely concur with that. I mean, one of the things that was really nice to experience and was refreshing from the perspective that I came from Houston, Greater Houston. So I was in Cypress, Texas. But yeah, it's a big city, right? It's there's a lot, and I kind of didn't know my neighbors so much, and there was a lot of rental properties where I lived, and people would move in and out, and you just never really kind of get that sense of community.
Right.
Conversely, when I moved to Leander, I made the purposeful effort of meeting my neighbors and knowing who was around me, and I was in a relatively new subdivision, so it was kind of growing. It was I wouldn't say one of the first, but I was in the early part of the development, right? So it's grown around me, so people have moved in, and so it's given an opportunity to kind of meet those people as they moved in. But yeah, I would agree for what you said, is that generally speaking, everybody's been really, really friendly, really accommodating, and helpful.
Yeah.
And one of my purposeful actions was, hey, I want to know my people. I want the people in my neighborhood, so I know my neighbors. But I also kind of wanted to get involved in the city, right? I saw some things here, and I was like, you know what? I saw this happen in Cypress, but Cypress was unincorporated there in Houston, so it was kind of weird. You really didn't have a whole lot of say, right? You saw things happening, but you couldn't really do anything about it. It was just like happening around you. Here, there's at least an opportunity to get involved, right?
Right.
So that's what you're doing now, right? You're kind of like getting involved. Prior to making a decision, I'm going to come back to this because I want to know what motivated you to make the decision to run. But prior to that, what type of involvement, civic or association-wise, what have you been involved with previously? Like where does that come from? Because there's always a little bit of a servant leadership piece to that, right? So what have you done previously, and then follow up with that? What motivated you to do this?
Yeah. So I would say more recently, within the last couple of years, more of our service-related items have been geared more towards our church.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're very active in our church, and my wife and I both serve in several leadership capacities within there, and we lead small groups and things like that. So that's been helpful, and it's been a great way to network and meet people as well. Prior to that, I served on a couple boards when we lived in Minnesota, also in Denver, Colorado.
Okay.
And also in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So have some exposure on kind of the giving back aspect. And none of those board positions were paid. It was just volunteer free time. But I've always had an inclination towards politics. I've always been very politically involved, but not necessarily politically active.
Right.
Until very recently.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. So the motivation to get involved here in Leander, what prompted that? What was it that you decided? Because that's a fairly big leap.
It is a big leap.
Right? It's a big leap. It's a leap of faith from the perspective of, hey, I can do this, right? And then it's also a leap of like, just putting yourself into the public sphere.
Right.
So what was it that motivated that for you here in Leander?
Having been through now a couple of mayors and councils, certainly we kind of talked about a few of the bigger issues that have happened. We had the winter storm and the issues with water, and we had COVID and all that stuff. I think as I've become more involved in my local community, have met a bunch of people who are definitely more politically active than I am. Learning about the issues, becoming passionate about those issues, and I like the term you use, servant leader, right? That in my capacity professionally, that is me to a T.
Right.
So I think, from a leadership aspect, I think I could definitely make a difference within the council.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, I think is I'm becoming more and more passionate about the local issues. When I sit there and scratch my head about why do we do that, or that's where it's like, hey, I feel like I can make a difference here.
Sure.
Right. And I'm definitely not a political guy, but I just like anybody else in Leander. So yeah.
So and I always make this distinction, and this is my distinction, right? I'm speaking strictly for myself. So because this is a nonpartisan election, as local elections are, there is there's a very minute difference between running for a council seat and then running for mayor, right? Basically, everyone is offering themselves up as a representative for the entire city because they are at large, right? There's you're representing some 39 odd square miles of space, right? And then there's the actual leadership position within the council, right? So the mayor is that one person, right? Equating everyone else on an equal footing, as an at-large representative, there's the council members are all representing the city of Leander and the citizens of Leander from that perspective. But the mayor is in a position that they are kind of guiding that process, right? Mm-hmm. They are saying, hey, I always say everybody runs for mayor, but only a few people say they want to be mayor, sure. Right? That's basically what it is. So from that perspective, what would you consider from your lifetime? And again, it can be anything. It doesn't matter. It's what we're trying to give people a sense of how you think and what motivates you. So what would you consider to be like a unique qualification or an experience where you feel that translates to that type of role, right?
Yeah. So I think definitely that servant leader mentality that I have just kind of naturally ingrained in me is one of the larger motivators. But I think more specifically in different leadership capacities that I've had with different organizations, I think being able to lead effective teams towards one goal, right? So in this instance, we're talking about the mayor of Leander, mm-hmm. right? And being able to lead the city council and help create a pathway towards better and bigger growth, more awareness throughout the city of Leander, right? Mm-hmm. I think those are some of the things that really, again, kind of prompted me to say, hey, let's do this.
Right.
Let's do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Again, you mentioned that you have some experience on boards and things of that nature. Is there? I was trying to suss out like a story. Like, tell me of a time where you had an opportunity to serve in a leadership role where you felt you were really effective. Like that, really, if you could do that again and again and again, what would be that one time? Like, oh, man, this was so fun. I really enjoyed it. I would love to do this over and over. What would that be? Or something like that. Wow. And it doesn't necessarily have to be your business, or it could be. It could be your business. It could be one of your roles. It could be your family. I mean, something that helps people understand, like, yeah, I got joy out of that, right?
It's an excellent question. Excellent question. There are certainly other things that come to mind, but I would say one of the board roles that I served on, we were in the metro area of Minneapolis and St. Paul, was for a local church. And we were trying to raise money for that particular church and coming up with creative ways to do that. And me and a couple of the board members kind of got together and had a sidebar conversation and really just kind of game planned out different fundraising events that had previously not been available to them for whatever reason, and really put a plan in place for them to. They were looking to expand one of their buildings, and really put a solid plan together on different fundraising ideas, how to do it, how to navigate it, and really go after that with an end goal of mind of a targeted dollar amount to raise. Once we kind of put that plan in place, we started these different events and things. We well surpassed that goal. The church was able to not only make the renovations and additions so that they needed to, and then some. So, I mean, that's one that stands out to me. Yeah. And it's really just being able to be that person to guide people towards the path.
Right.
Make them understand, hey, maybe this is a better way.
Right. So how do you suss out the best ideas? Because that's always something that if you're going to, I would say, if you're going to put yourself into a leadership position, right, one of the things that you want to do is ensure that not every idea is crazy, not every idea is great, right? So you have to kind of filter that down to like, okay, and sometimes that involves some compromise, right?
Absolutely.
So what would you say, generally speaking, like how do you make some of that determination? What are some of the things that you look for when you're trying to find the best path?
Yeah. I think there's something to be said for the tried and true method. We've been there, we've done this, it's worked for us in the past, and that's always an effective go-to. I tend to think of myself as a little bit of a out-of-the-box thinker.
Okay.
So if there's avenues that are a little bit more creative, never been tried before,
Sure.
Let's try it. Why not? What's the worst that can happen?
Right.
Well,
I mean,
for the most part. I mean, but yeah. I mean, I'm trying to just constantly think outside the box, and that's kind of the operator in me sometimes. If there's a better mousetrap, let's do it.
Right.
So.
And I agree with you from that perspective. Like, again, when we are looking at any kind of project, whatever that project might be, right, there is an opportunity to be creative and bring creative thinking into those projects. Like, what have we done? Like, what's tried and true? What have we always done? And is there an opportunity to improve on that, or is there an opportunity to change that in such a way that maybe it yields a different result, right? I like to say, I mean, this is just me, but I like to say, hey, failure is an option. Like, it is an option. It's not off the table. I think that's probably one of the biggest misnomers in my experience, not only personally, but in business. I'm like, of course it's an option. It can happen, right? We don't win that piece of business or, whatever it might be. So you have to take that into account too, right? So if you're going to try something, you're trying it with a sense of, well, we're going to try this. May not work, right? But we're going to give it a go, right? We're going to give it a go.
That's actually one of my own, more professional, but in personal life too, my kind of personal guiding leadership principles. Failure is encouraged.
Right.
How else are you going to learn?
Right.
You got to learn these lessons. So,
no, I agree. I was actually, I had a mentor at one point and my background, again, I don't know if you know this from me, but I'm in sales. I've been in sales my entire career. Sales or sales adjacent, right? There's always something regarding that. And at one point in my career coming up, I had a mentor who we were sitting there, we were talking about, it was a lost business report. We were talking about lost business, right? And so we're kind of lamenting over some business that we had lost and whatnot. And there was some junior salespeople involved in the process. And he said, he goes, that fail is an acronym, right? And I'm like, is it? And I was like, no, it's a word. And he's like, no, let me show you. So he spelled it out on the whiteboard. He was like, first attempt in learning, right? And I was like, wow, that just completely shifted the paradigm for me because I'd never looked at it that way, right? And so there's a good opportunity to fail forward, if you will, right? Because you're learning, you're figuring out what doesn't work and how you can do things better, right? So I think that's great. I mean, I think it's always refreshing to hear somebody speak in that way. To me, personally, I mean, I'm speaking strictly for myself, but someone who recognizes that that's part of that's part of the process, right? Because again, far too many times I think there's a tendency, and maybe it's just the way we grow up, or I don't know if it's culture or not. I won't go that far, but it's win at all expenses, right? Win. We're so oriented being the champions and being number one and all that stuff that we never really talk about what happens when you don't win, right? Like
Right.
I would love it if more times, instead of interviewing to be topical, instead of interviewing the NCAA champion, interview the guys that didn't win, right? Like, what are they thinking? What are they? What's their perspective? Because we know what the winners are going to say, right?
Absolutely.
We kind of know what they're going to say, right? So anyway, that's interesting. I appreciate you kind of going down that pathway with me. So a couple of things that we've kind of prompted, and I believe I've shared this with you. So if for any reason any of these questions, like, hey, I'm really not prepared to answer that question, just feel free to say so. But like, we know here in Leander, and in my experience in Leander, and I think you would probably share this opinion, but if you don't, that's fine. Small business is a big component in a rural city, a rural community that is rapidly changing, right? That is the driver. Eventually you see the bigger boxes come in, and there's obviously an opportunity in Leander right now to have outside investment into our city, right? And create jobs and create a diversification of the tax base. I think we are going down that path.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to me, it seems like, okay,
Certainly
that's what we've
feels that
chosen
way.
to
Yep.
do, right? And we could have chosen at that point, a few years ago or whatever the case, we could have said, you know what, we're just going to be a bedroom community. It's just going to be residential, and we'll live with that, right? But we've purposely, I believe, made some choices that are leading us in a little bit of a different path and from diversification. But before that diversification can ever occur, there needs to be a small business driver, right? So in your business, I'm assuming it's not Leander local, right? You're working for a larger
Correct.
corporate
Correct.
entity. What has been your exposure to small business in the city of Leander? I mean, it could be through your social contacts, some of your service-oriented contacts. I mean, you've mentioned some things you do with the church. Certainly, you've had some conversations about small business in Leander. What's your general sense there? Like, what are your thoughts, and how can we help bolster that as part of our process?
Yeah, and I think, to your point, we are going down that path, and I will definitely give the current and former councils credit for recognizing that, right? But I think to that extent that, when we talk about growth, right, we talk about small business. So not ever owning a small business myself, certainly some people that I have been friends with since we've moved here have opened up small businesses, and that's just ingrained in them, in that entrepreneurial spirit that they have. I think that, to your point, is definitely the backbone of our community, and how we continue to grow. Some of the bigger chains, they're going to come in.
Right.
The McDonald's and all, they're going to be here.
That's
right?
You're right. That stuff's going to
avoid that.
show up. You can't avoid it, and it's going to happen anyway. There's only so much that we do to necessarily. I would say there's opportunity there to encourage them to come.
Sure.
But beyond that, they're going to look at demographics. They're going to look at population, and they're going to make a decision.
Yep. And they definitely have a place in a community like Leander. And as we continue to grow, to be determined what that will look like. But from a small business aspect, I think it's really incumbent upon the mayor and the city council to encourage that growth from a small business perspective, right? Because we don't want to, even though we know we're going to grow, we don't want to, me personally, I don't want to lose that small town feel, right? I want to have the small mom and pop shops, right? I'm a customer of those. My wife is as well. So whatever we can do to incentivize that growth, as well as the larger commercial spaces and stuff like that, that's definitely one of my priorities, is to ensure we are not only encouraging, but enticing people to, hey, if you were on the fence about doing this, what can we do to have you open it? Let's make this happen.
Right. No, so. I think, again, I agree with the statement of, we need to encourage that, because the risk that you run with the larger corporate entities, or franchises and stuff like that, is that there are mechanisms and influences on their decision making that are completely out of our purview and our control, right? So, I mean, I would point to what many people would think is a positive. If you look at the life cycle of Krispy Kreme donuts, for instance, right? So Krispy Kreme became the belle of the ball, I don't know, late 90s, early 2000s, right? And then there were Krispy Kremes everywhere, right? Shareholders were happy, everybody's making money. And then something happened in the economy and the way that people were eating, frankly. It changed that, right? Yep. And all of a sudden you see this downturn. If your community has, let's just say, 2, 3 Krispy Kremes, I don't know how far apart they keep those stores, to be honest with you. But let's just say you have that. Then all of a sudden that goes away, right? That has nothing to do with anybody, but maybe the local franchisee, right? But outside of that, that's not within their purview. They're affected by something that happens outside of that, right? So it's always a little bit of concern, personally for me, like when I look at some of the development, even currently that we see, whether or not there's enough diversity in the way that we allow for that and are subject to some of that type of development, right? COVID really gave us a real good lesson in overemphasizing the service industry. And coming from the hotel industry myself, I mean, that's where I got a lot of my background. I could see it. Like, it was like, oh, wow, those cities that have, like Austin, you saw it in Austin, right? There's so many people lost jobs and so many hotels suffered just because of what was happening, right? But there wasn't enough diversity in that particular sector to be able to maintain it. You saw a number of restaurants that just disappeared, right? So you kind of want to avoid that from a city planning perspective. And I think small businesses help with that. I mean, because again, they're a little bit more diverse. Yeah. Because there's all sorts of things that they do.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I think that's incumbent upon the council to really be thoughtful when they're planning out the next 5, 10, 8 years to really, and we talk about zoning, we talk about all this other stuff, I think they need to really have a solid plan in place to what sort of Leander do we want? Right. Do we want Walmarts and Targets everywhere? Right. Or do we want, some of that, but we also want Grand Donuts and all these stuff like that. So I think it's a valid point. I think it's I think that's one of the roles of local government is really to be more of the facilitator of growth rather than the regulator of growth. Right. In some regards.
Right. Yeah. I think we're probably thinking the same thing here, right? You just need to be mindful of that, and right now is a really critical period of time in the city's growth, right? Because when I first got here, and it was shortly before you got here, I would say close to 50,000 people or so, like ish, right? And I've had conversations with candidates already that they were here when there were 7,000 people here, right? So it was exponential growth, right? I mean, at one point we were the fastest growing city in the United States, and that's bananas, right? Because all due respect and all due regard to all of those who were participating in that process and were responsible for executing on a lot of those things, I think it's fair to say there's no way you can plan for that, right? That you cannot. You can maybe see that it might be coming, but when it happens, you're like, there's no way. It's too fast. It's hard to keep up. So a lot of what we're doing now is a little bit of catch-up, right? And so from that perspective, what are your thoughts on measures that could be taken? Like if you're in that position, you're in a leadership position, and you're thinking through some of the things that are going to happen to the city going forward. How do you steward, responsible development and balanced development, right? I mean, and Damon, I don't want you to get me wrong here, right? I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I want to know your thoughts on what you consider to be that. Like, how do we balance that out as even just as a citizen? What would you like to see, right? And this goes beyond the business discussion that we just had. This is more, a 50-50 argument, a 60-40. You know what I mean by that?
Yeah. And it's funny. This is question I get asked regularly. So I think, to your point, it has to be a good balance between commercial and residential. And I think in years past, we definitely leaned as a city more towards residential.
Agreed.
Right? And now we're playing catch up. But I think, if I had to put a percentage on it, 60-40 commercial and residential, right?
Okay.
But it has to be somewhat balanced, right? Because I think at a macro level, when things kind of settle down, the growth is going to continue and come.
Right.
It's going to keep coming.
Right.
People need a place to live.
Sure.
They need restaurants to go to, shops to go to. They need all of that. So I think it's got to be a balanced approach. And I think, kind of going back to what I said before, that's where the city council really needs to do a deep dive and think of what is the path? How do we get there? How do we be responsible? And how do we make an impact on the everyday citizens of Leander to give them, so they don't have to go to Austin for date night.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have to go to Georgetown. They don't have to go to these places. It's all right here.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I mean, I had the opportunity and the pleasure of serving on the comprehensive planning committee, right? A couple of years ago now, I think it is, and that was a very interesting perspective on things, right? Because that's a plan that is revised, I think, every 5 years, I want to say, right? So when we look back, like my opportunity there was to be able to look back at what some of the planning had been, right? Like these are things that they thought, well, okay, this could work, right? And kind of to our conversation earlier where we were saying, yeah, try it, see if it works. If it doesn't work, right? So you had that going on. But you'll hear a lot of people, and maybe you've heard this too, a lot of people in Leander, and in the time that I've been here, one of the things that has been a constant is, who are we, right? Like, what's the brand? Like, what is Leander about, right? And you'll talk to different people. And I've had an opportunity to speak with, a couple of the different candidates now for mayor, and there's been comments there of like, I think a unifying theme is the small town component, right? I think everybody has some variant of that conversation, right? You've spoken of it today. Like, it's one of the things that attracts you to the city. And, frankly, it attracts me as well, right? So if we take that and say, okay, all right, hey, that's part of it, right? That is the challenge. And especially right now, to mirror and to echo what you're saying, a lot of the growth that's coming to Leander is going to come to Leander. Whether if we just sat here and did nothing, it's going to happen, right? It just is. It's the pressures that are being executed in greater Central Texas, right? Austin's trying to find land.
Right.
They're trying to create places where they can grow, right? Because they're kind of landlocked. They're stuck. They're digging 35 underground to. Those are great projects. I mean, I think some of that stuff is really a good idea. Like, I saw it in Boston when Boston did that, right? Boston covered up one of the freeways and created a space to grow to. It's benefited them to great degree, right? We see that happening in Austin. Then there's this like the South Congress stuff that's going on too, to where they're looking to build out South Congress. Yep. So that's going to happen anyway, right? And then you have people like, you have the Samsungs and the Teslas of the world, and they're creating these pressures, right? So there's a natural growth that's going to happen. That's what I saw in Houston. That's what I always reflected to. Like, I'm out in Cypress. I was out in Cypress at a time where there was a Cajun bar out there, and that was about it. Right. There was nothing else out there, right? And then next thing I know, Walmart and loss of dark sky, right? Right. So, from that perspective, we know it's going to happen, and I appreciate some of your comments there, like just kind of how we balance that out and get to that point, right? So, kind of change. I want to change the subject a little bit here, just because we're kind of flirting with that council kind of conversation, and you and I had a little chance to chat right before we started, and it's like, yeah, you were nice enough to tell me you appreciate what I'm doing here from a just creating the conversations, right? So transparency is always something that's a conversation, right? Like how much we know and when we know it. And, I think again here, I don't know if you would agree necessarily, but I think here again, the current council has done a good job of creating more transparency, right? There's been updates to the website. There's a lot of things that you can participate in now, and you can subscribe to news flashes and things of that nature. That's a good thing. That's the right direction. What would you, in a leadership position, do to continue, complement, expand? Yeah, how do you help with that?
Yeah. So and I know we spoke about it, but couldn't agree more. I think that level of community engagement could be better.
Okay.
Again, give credit to the current council. They're making efforts to engage the public, right? I think, whether it's Leander or any place we've ever lived, there's people have lives. They're busy. Everybody's busy, right? And I think with the popularity of all social media,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that's definitely an avenue. I think a lot more community events.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime that current, former, future councils and mayors can have the opportunity to get out and just talk about the issues and really solicit ideas from the citizens, that's where you're going to get your best information from.
I agree.
It's one-to-one conversations. How did we do here?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? How can we do it better, right? I think that's maybe an area where there's some opportunities. So, yeah, I mean, any chance, whether it's a local newsletter, mass emails, whatever the case is, all technology tools at our disposal, blast that information out. Hey, guys, we have this coming up on this date. We're going to talk about X, Y, and Z. Really encourage everybody to get out. Come to the city council meetings, right? Whatever efforts we can do to further engage the citizens, it's a win-win.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Again, I mean, obviously, I feel that we're doing a better job here in the city of that, but I do agree that there's still a good opportunity to increase that,
Yeah.
right? And to your point, I think I would be a good idea. I'd love to see more non-election period engagement.
Agree.
Agreed. I mean, and there are avenues. Okay, I'm not going to pretend that there's not. You can, if you're a citizen so inclined and you want to become a little bit more participatory, hey, volunteer for a committee. Get involved, start making your voice part of that process. 100%. That's one of the routes that's available, right? But that said, there are limitations to what committees can do. I mean, in our space, to be honest, and having served on multiple committees, aside from LPAC, nobody has a budget. Nobody has any real influence, right? It's an advisory. It's an information and idea gathering place, right? Properly executed can be very effective, right? But there's limitations to that, and then you layer in some of the restrictions that occur when you start doing that from a legislative perspective and the open meetings rules and stuff like that. It gets complicated. It's not easy, right? But I think there is opportunity for candidates like yourself and for actual elected officials after the fact to open up that space, right? Not saying you always have to sit down with me, but it's a good venue, right?
It's a great venue.
Yeah, it's a good way to kind of just have a conversation, talk about some of the things, and there's always well, we can't talk about that because we're competing with other cities and blah blah blah, and that's fair, but really, I mean, is Hutto going to learn that much from an open conversation, right? And they obviously would have different pursuits because they have different objectives, right? So anyway, so I appreciate your taking the time here today and kind of following on the path, right? Just kind of coming along. I've enjoyed this conversation immensely, and it's really nice to meet people who have, again, that servant leadership mentality, who are looking really like, what can I do to help? What can I do to make a change? And I always say this, the best of luck on your endeavors. I certainly hope that everything works out the way that you want it to work out. And if there's ever an opportunity that I could encourage anybody, I'd say, hey, if if stay involved, right? I
Yeah.
mean, this is just that one time, and this is the first effort, right? So
Yeah.
we can fail,
Yeah.
but let's stay involved, and because I think you add an interesting voice to the mix. I mean, I'll be perfectly honest. Having met you for the first time, and I would say that about all the candidates. Some of them have been around a little bit, and I know them. You know, I know of them. But this group in this particular election cycle is pretty new. They're people that I'm not familiar with. So this has been really enjoyable for me to get engaged with them and have that conversation. I certainly hope you feel the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would encourage all your listeners. Have to put a plug in for my website.
Yeah, no,
That's
absolutely.
okay.
I was just about to tell you,
Yeah,
hey,
yeah. So,
you can look at the camera, give them a straight out face, and that. Where can they find you? What are your socials? What are your websites? You know, how do they get in touch with Damon Burger?
Yeah. So really encourage you to check us out at Damon Burger, the number 4, Leander.com. I've got some issues up there and what I stand for, and yeah.
Is that are you on any of the other social medias, any Instagram or anything like that
So
that
I
you're
am
doing?
not.
Okay.
LinkedIn is as far
Okay.
down the social media rabbit hole as I go at the moment. But yeah, I really encourage you guys to check out my website and see what we're all about.
Right. No, well, Damon, I certainly do appreciate, again, you've taken the time. It happens to be a Friday, and it's at the end of the day, so I really, really do appreciate
My
that.
pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure from my perspective. And for those of you who have, engaged here on the Lean and Leander podcast and our website and whatnot, I appreciate the comments. I appreciate the suggestions. It's definitely something that I take a look at, so, keep them coming. Like and subscribe, as they say. And you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, YouTube, other various social medias. We'll throw a few things out there from time to time just to let you know what's going on. But take the time to get yourself registered to vote. Today is March 29th, so technically there's probably about 6 days left to do that. Just a little information there. If you've lived here, if you just moved here, you're here 30 days, you can register to vote. As soon as you do your driver's license, again, an opportunity to register to vote. And get that done by April 4th so that you can participate in the May 4th election. At the very least, if you don't do that, and for some reason you miss that, take the opportunity to go out and meet the candidates. Meet Damon, meet some of the other candidates when you have the opportunity to. I know that there's several things that occur, many of the local associations and, I think the chamber does some things and stuff like that. So find out what these people are about. And hopefully what we've done here today helps you learn a little bit more about Damon. And hopefully that helps you make your decision. So at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. Get out there and vote. It's why we do the series. It's why we present these things in this way so that you have an opportunity to meet these folks. And you don't get the chance to sit down with them one-on-one. I do. I'm fortunate. And I'm doing that so that, hopefully it helps you get a little bit of insight. So, Damon, thank you so much. I really, really do appreciate it. This was
Pleasure
very
is
nice.
mine.
And for those of you, that's it for today's episode. But again, keep your eyes on the voteandleander.com website as well as leanandleander.net, and we'll continue to post information on this election cycle, and hopefully it helps you make your decisions. So thanks a lot, folks, for tuning in, and we'll see you at the next one.